Avis, cette capsule a été produite simultanément en français et en anglais. Notice, this episode was produced simultaneously in English and French. Vous écoutez présentement la version anglaise. You are currently watching the English version.
Hello and welcome to Stereotypic STeist. I'm your host Guy from the other day. In this episode we are going to discuss the adaptation of a fighting game originally designed for the Commodore 64, published in 1987, which I played for the first time on the Atari ST and from which I quickly tired for reasons I will explain. Developed by Palace Software and published by Epyx in North America, this game is Barbarian, the Ultimate Warrior. First, regarding fighting games, there have been hundreds or even thousands of them since the 1980s. Here are some examples.
Usually these are fighting games featuring martial arts, fist and kick, but there have been a number of exceptions such as Last Blade 2, which includes weapons. On consoles, a great cult classic is Stahlkiefer, featured here in its Dreamcast version. It illustrates the 3D of the 6th generation of consoles, and it shows. As for the Neo Geo, one of the classic cult games is Samurai Shodown. Images are raster, but we have scrolling, scaling, and animation.
I insist on the use of bladed weapons, in particular pole, or weapons that you can throw, just to name a few.
It's not much different from martial arts fighting games. Those that involve bladed weapons also feature attack moves using the legs. But similarities don't end there. Usually each of the opponents has a maximum energy level at the start of each round. Every time an opponent takes a hit, his energy decreases until he passes out or dies, depending.
Needless to say, it's usually an EFAG or excuse for a game.
Despite the alleged level of violence, this is not realistic. In a fight using stabbing weapons, it would probably end on the first blow. But it's a game, hence I don't want it to end as soon as I take a hit.
But I'll come back to this later regarding Barbarian.
The story goes that the wizard Drax covets Princess Mariana and has sworn to put a spell on the people of Jeweled City if she is not delivered to him. That being said, he will consent to free her if a warrior manages to defeat his guards, meaning guardians.
And need I remind you that we have our EFAG here?
What I mean is, it's like for Turrican, which I talked about a few weeks ago. The synopsis doesn't really matter. This is the case with Mortal Kombat, a classic among fighting games, and rather controversial at the time of its release. Two opponents face each other in different locations, and the difficulty increases as you go.
I'll come back to this aspect later. Let's say for now that generally, the first opponents are easier to defeat.
This is a golden rule of game design in general. The difficulty must increase whether regarding the opponent's skills or level design. The player must feel like he or she is progressing and overcoming challenges to have that feeling of accomplishment.
Now that I've loosely covered fighting games in general, I'm going to talk about Barbarian, the Ultimate Warrior.
First, the game was designed for the Commodore 64. Its concept is a bit different from other fighting games like International Karate, namely because of the use of weapons. The objective of the game is to face and defeat 10 competitors or guardians to finally get to Drax, the evil wizard, and free Princess Mariana.
So far, nothing really enigmatic. We have a villain and a princess to rescue.
Although the question of a princess wearing a bikini was controversial at the time of the game's initial release, particularly because of the cover art.
I'll get back to that bikini princess later because in fact she has a twin sister.
The protagonist that you control will sequentially face the opponents mentioned previously in a few settings, the first two of which alternate, namely the forest and the barren wastes. It's only at the end that you reach the throne room, then the pit, so to speak.
It's okay to only having 4 settings in which to fight. The game on the ST came on a single-sided floppy disk, which means it can hold approximately 360 to 410 kilobytes of data.
The set's images are quite neat and obviously drawn using software. It's the sprites that leave something to be desired. Looks like they were copied pretty much as is from the Commodore 64 version, without taking advantage of the Atari ST's more nuanced color palette. Seriously, for the Commodore 64 we divide the horizontal resolution in half to illustrate more colors per cell. Thus, the 320 by 200 pixels resolution becomes 160 by 200 pixels, which allows to illustrate 4 colors per cell from a palette of 16 fixed colors.
As for the controls, it's close to a PUAP.
Taking into account that the protagonist is facing right, without pressing the button, left and right are used to move, up is used to jump, down is used to crouch.
So far, no surprises.
Still, without the button being pressed, diagonally downwards allows to roll either forwards or backwards. Always without any button pressed, diagonally upwards is used to protect either the head or the body accordingly. By pressing the button, we get attack moves, very often using the sword. Clockwise, up, blow to the neck or neck chop. Up and right, headbutt. Right, body chop. Down and right, kick. Down, leg chop. Down and left, overhead chop. Left, flying head chop. Up and left, web of death.
Well, that's what it's called in the manual. The most spectacular blow is the one to the neck, as it can lead to decapitation. I'll get back to it later.
Animation-wise, if there is such a word, the response time is pretty good, but the animation is somewhat jerky again because I think it was copied from the Commodore 64 version, which only had 64 kilobytes of memory, thus it was limited in terms of number of animation frames and settings.
Although, could we have had more animation frames on the ST?
If each sprite frame occupies 64 by 64 pixels on the ST, this means 2048 bytes or 2 kilobytes. If we have 4 frames per action and 16 possible actions, say, that brings us to 128 kilobytes for the protagonist looking to the right.
But the protagonist can also face left, and that goes for the antagonist, whose skin can be of a different color than that of the protagonist.
Thus, we, in principle, double the memory requisition just for the animation, which brings us to 256 kilobytes. That's more than half the usable memory of a 520 ST, not taking into account the settings and the digitized sound effects. So I would say what could have been improved on the ST would have been the visuals of the opponents. Admittedly, with the 1040 ST we could have had more animation frames and or larger sprites and or more scenes or settings. Regardless, I remind you that what matters in terms of playability is maneuverability. After all, I know that I mention this often, but in Super Mario Bros. On the NES, there aren't that many frames for the protagonist Mario.
Sound-wise, unlike International Karate Plus, to mention solely this one, we use either the tone channels for the music or the noise channel for digital sound effects.
Regarding the latter, the samples were taken from the movie Red Sonja, which starred Brigitte Nielsen and Arnold Schwarzenegger. It's a nice touch, and it's something I expect from the Atari ST. You can't play 2 sound effects simultaneously unless you use some tricks that I'll talk about in a future episode, but since they're somewhat short, it doesn't matter. You can also choose to hear the music through the tone channels instead by pressing the F9 key. It's a tune that loops. It was composed by the late Richard Joseph, who composed many tunes for video games from his early teens through his early 50s.
I'll eventually do an episode on music composers for video games.
Now that I've talked about game design, I'm going to show you some flaws, starting with the difficulty in achieving the game's objective.
It's not something I read on the internet, it's something I experienced shortly after acquiring the game.
I explained earlier that one of the most spectacular blows is the one that causes decapitation of the opponent. That being said, I discovered that a very systematic combination of specific moves is sure to result in such a round-ending decapitation. Seriously, to capture the footage of what you're currently watching, I only had to play for a few minutes.
The problem is, once I figured out the algorithm, I had no reason to use the other moves.
In the game's defense, however, I must admit that the sequences of blows leading to a swift decapitation are only valid on the Atari ST. The same algorithm doesn't work on the Amiga. Another way to complete each round is to corner the opponent to one end of the screen and to kick him or slash him using your sword.
And this method has been mentioned and criticized many times.
Regarding the game's ending, it's the equivalent of playing tag. All you have to do is dodge a few of the projectiles thrown by the evil Drax and roll, and voila!
And here's the icing on the cake.
Once you've rolled into Drax, the princess is free and appears in the middle of the arena or pit under her twin sister's gaze.
It's a small detail, but I noticed it.
Regarding other versions, at least a few, I have to mention the one for the Amiga, which seems to me a notch better than that of the ST. On the visual side, the screen generally is of the same resolution as that of the ST, but uses 5 bit planes instead of 4, which makes it possible to illustrate 32 colors out of 4096 instead of 16 out of 512. Sound-wise, the channels can simultaneously play music and digitize sound effects, and these effects are in stereo. We also have a voiceover that announces "Prepare to die" at the beginning of each round, and a sort of drum beat at the end when the goblin carries off the body of the defeated fighter. That said, the adaptation remains dependent on the available memory, and the Amiga didn't really have more than the Atari ST. Speaking of Commodore, here's the C64 version, which is the original. As mentioned before, we are limited to 16 fixed colors, using half the resolution to illustrate more of them per cell. Music and sound effects alternate, thus they are not played simultaneously. On the Amstrad, it's quite good and very colorful. As on the Commodore 64, music and sound effects alternate, thus they are not played simultaneously. Some games for the Amstrad CPC never cease to amaze me, even if I sometimes wonder about the efficiency of the Z80A processor, which ran, in theory, at 4 MHz. The DOS version, which is called Death Sword, runs in CGA mode with the pastel palette representing pink, cyan, black and white. The fighters' illustrations seem to have been modeled on those of the Commodore 64, and the sound uses the beeper.
It's an odd choice considering that the EGA graphics card already existed at the time.
The Apple II version, for its part, runs in the double high-resolution mode, which allows to illustrate 16 colors instead of 6. The problem is that the processor remains clocked at 1 MHz, and that the sound effects also use the beeper. Finally, the game was remastered for Windows with visual improvements, so there was an interest.
I spare you the other versions for other systems. However, I will take a moment to tell you a bit about the sequel.
Barbarian 2 is akin to adventure games with successive screens with more animation as well as a digital sound environment. It's a bit confusing though, as the universe spreads in all directions but is always presented from a left-right perspective. It reminds me a bit of Heroes of the Lands, which features a universe that scrolls left or right but is actually explored in all 4 cardinal directions.
Something that sparked controversy at the time was, in part, the game's cover, which featured model Mariah Whittaker wearing a bikini.
Yes, it's true that with Mariah Whittaker wearing a bikini and Samantha Fox topless in the 1980s, there was enough to cause a lot of discomfort to teenage boys in full puberty.
The level of violence, on the other hand, is almost an abstraction given that there aren't many people nowadays walking the streets shirtless with a sword to decapitate everyone else.
This was an era when survival could depend on the weapon you had with you and your skills in wielding it. Also, it's a game. During the video capture process for rotoscoping, none of the actors had their heads chopped off.
I won't dwell here on having done better for Barbarian the Ultimate Warrior because I've talked about this earlier, but what about its replayability?
I'm mixed on the issue besides the fact that the game may be short. If you're going up against friends, that might hold water, but that's true for any fighting game. That said, rivaling against artificial intelligence, I sometimes feel like it's a button masher, i.e., I have no idea what I'm doing or what I want to do. I press all the buttons and hope the opponent takes a hit.
There you have it. This was today's episode. If you enjoyed it, please give me a thumb up. Thanks also to my patrons via Patreon. If you wish to support me, the sums collected are used in particular for better equipment, thus quality content. Contributors could also have access to exclusive content, for example, footage related to makings of, and not only for YouTube episodes. I also have a Facebook group if you want to stay up to date. Moreover, if you haven't already done so, I invite you to subscribe to my channel by clicking on the subscribe button and to let me know in the comments of your appreciation of Barbarian, the Ultimate Warrior. Finally, if there are any games you would like me to talk about in future episodes, let me know. I'm Guy from the other day. See you soon.